Appreciate it. And thanks to the bunch of you for not going to Michael Devitt's talk instead. It's a thrill to be able to draw something of a crowd. Before I get started, you should know that I have managed to maintain my 100% record of getting sick at AAP. So if at any point I stop making sense, that's why. And I might just tag in as if I get completely off track. Now, what I'm going to talk to you today about is it's a bit of a funny paper to do at a generalist conference like AAP, but it's what I had ready in time for the submission. So I'm dealing with sense of agency research as a branch of consciousness studies. And what I'm worried about with this literature, even though I've been involved with it heavily for a few years now, is that it doesn't integrate very well with the rest of consciousness studies. So it's been incredibly productive so far as it goes, but there are some questions that aren't just aren't being asked within the literature which need to be. So that's what I'm going to try and make a case for and point to a few ways in which the questions might be asked and which we might start to think productively about getting answers to them. So what I'll do is talk about a couple of fairly standard explanations in sense of agency research, the comparator model, and the inference to apparent mental state causation, which comes from Dan Wegner, who we sadly lost last year. And just as a way of showing that you get a certain type of explanation in sense of agency research, what I'm going to call proximal etiological explanations. Then after that I'm going to talk briefly about something called the occasionality problem, which is sometimes raised as an objection to these models within the sense of agency research. I'm going to suggest that if we were to start thinking more seriously about whether the distinction between unconscious representations and conscious experiences of agency, that the problem just doesn't arise in the first place. And this is really going to drive us through to what I want the take-home message to be, which is sense of agency research needs to be taking this distinction seriously and thinking about what it needs to add to the models that it already produces in order to explain how sometimes you get a conscious sense of agency, whereas other times you only get unconscious representations of agency. So, when I'm talking about the sense of agency, I just mean an experience that you yourself are the agent of an action. So you're the initiator, the controller of the action. Now, we have, since the mid-90s, generated a really big literature on when this sense might get elicited. And in particular, we focused a lot on enumerating the causes of this. So we generally provide accounts that are, like I say, causal, but they're also particularly cognitive, by which I mean that the causes which are picked out are cognitive causes, so they're representations and computations. So these are properties which are shared by a lot of prominent accounts of the sense of agency. So some of you might know the comparator model, which came out of the work of Chris Frith and so on, which says you get a sense of agency when what actual sensory feedback you get is represented as matching what sensory feedback you predict you're going to get. Now, this prediction has to be based on motor commands. So there's like a cascade. You have something like a motor intention. I need to get to this point in space in order to achieve an action that I'm performing. This then produces motor commands. Two copies of motor commands, one of which goes to the periphery and moves the body. The other goes to predict it and generates a prediction of what's going to happen. and then the hypothesis is that when the prediction is represented as matching the actual feedback, then you get a sense of agency. So this is a standard sort of account. The other sort of standard account is the one from Wegner's lab, and they suggest that it's not, sense of agency is elicited not so much by this low-level motor process, but rather by the subject being able to infer that one or other of their mental states causes their action. So if I do something like pick up the drink and have it, I feel like I'm the one who did that because I can infer that my intention to get a drink driven by my thirst is a cause of me doing that. Now, then the work in this model is done by spelling out how that inference is made, and the suggestion is the inference is made automatically whenever three principles are met. That is, there is a thought which is a potential cause of the action, which is prior to the action within the right time frame, principle of priority. So you can't infer that memories have that, you know, later on when you're remembering doing something, you don't infer that it's the memory which causes you. It just, you know, simple stuff. Has to be consistent with the action that is performed. So if I have you know, an intention to, you know, get a Coke, that's not going to be inferred as a reason why I got water, because there's an incompatibility there. And the last one is, last principle is exclusivity, so the mental state needs to be picked out as the only available cause. So, you know, if I have an intention to open the door, these doors, I'm on my way out, open the door, but someone else is opening at the same time, I'm not the only available cause for it, so I'll infer that the other person is also a cause. Sorry, my mental state isn't the only available cause. So that's where the work is done in these kinds of models. I'm not too fussed about the details of them today, although I think there are a lot of really interesting debates there. I mean, what I want to pick out is the feature that these explanations both have, which is it's just a causal story. We're just going from the beginning of some action or some such up until this representation of agency being elicited. A lot of modern accounts which build on these, I mean, a lot of people now are combining the accounts and saying they're both, or they're working on Bayesian models of Q integration, such that lots of different things add up to eliciting the sense of agency. And all of these newer accounts share this property of what the proximal etiological explanations. They pick out or enumerate the immediate causes of the sense of agency being elicited. Now, that's by just like a couple of highlights on, you know, the last 20 years or so of sense of agency research, that, you know, this is what we've all been doing. Cool. So one problem that I think this has is these accounts don't distinguish between the model saying an unconscious representation of own agency is elicited when these conditions are met, from these instances where it's a conscious experience. I think this is something which is important. I mean, for starters, it would be really weird if sense of agency was the only mental representation which could only ever be conscious when it's elicited. That would just be bizarre. That would be unique in the world. But I want to do a little bit of work to suggest that there are theoretical payoffs within the sense of agency research to saying, well, we need to make this distinction between when the output of whatever model we end up choosing is conscious and when it's an unconscious representation. Thanks for your patience, the throat's quite sore, so I just need to pause it now and then. Alright, so the way I want to suggest that this does have theoretical payoffs within the sense of agency literature is to look at a particular problem that was raised first as an objection to the comparator model, but which also can be extended to be an objection to Wegener's model and various others. And I want to suggest that if we just start thinking more about this unconscious conscious representation distinction, that the problem actually is just a non-problem, it just doesn't arise in the first place. So before we get to the problem, let's talk about the circumstances where it's supposed to apply, and this is in the explanation of delusions of alien control, which are a popular target for explanations within for sense of agency models, because they seem to involve a deficit in the sense of agency. So this delusion is a psychiatric symptom. Obviously it's common in schizophrenia, although it's of course not exclusive to that disorder, as you know, none of the symptoms of schizophrenia are exclusive to schizophrenia. But that's a common context. So, so this delusion is that the patient believes that they're not the agent of their actions, and more specifically, they believe that someone else is the agent of their actions. I think the most interesting example of these come up in experimental settings. So Spence did this study. It was a brain imaging study with people who were currently experiencing this delusion and just getting them to perform actions with a joystick. Simple stuff. Not particularly emotionally laden, not particularly distressing. So we'd like to think sort of tackling the experience fairly purely to the extent that can be done. But these are some of the things that the patients would say when they were asked about how they felt while they were doing these sorts of actions. I felt like I'm an automaton guided by a female spirit who entered me during it. That's referring to the movement. I thought you, the experimenter, were varying the movements with your thoughts. And I could feel God guiding me during the movement. Now, we see here that the subject is not only denying their own agency, but they're attributing it to another specific agent, the female spirit, the experimenter, God. Right. So, the kinds of accounts we've been talking about for the sense of agency sort of work on an assumption that you can divide this delusion up into two parts. And this follows from Ma's work on delusions, where they suggest that the first thing that you need to explain is why the patient doesn't feel like they're in control of the action, and then you need an additional explanation to explain why it's attributed to a specific other. And then in making that distinction, the sense of agency mob will say, we're working on the first part, the why don't they self-attribute it. Now, this, like I said, comes from Ma's work on delusions, who argued that all delusions arise from an attempt by the patient or the subject to explain a highly salient but very unusual experience. So, again, working from that assumption, the highly salient but unusual experience here would be the absence of a sense of agency, and the explanation for that is there's some other agent controlling it. Now,
good news, everyone!
Not everyone within the delusions literature agrees with this model. There's quite a lot of interesting debates about whether or not the inference from the unusual experience to the delusional explanation involves normal reasoning, or whether there's an additional deficit in the reasoning there. But my point is, not so much that we need to universally endorse Ma's model of delusions, so much as if you think that sense of agency research has anything to say about delusions of alien control, this is the kind of assumption that you need to be working with. Right. So, now we get to the problem. If you have something like the comparator model, their explanation of why the sense of agency is missing in these cases is because patients fail to represent the predicted sensory consequences of action as matching the actual sensory consequences or the actual sensory feedback. A bunch of reasons to think that's because of a problem in actually forming or using the representation of predictions. I'm not going to talk about that today. But then the question is, why, if that's the explanation, why don't these patients or these subjects lack a sense of agency for all of their actions? And this is something which turns up, is that even when the patients are floridly delusional and experiencing this, they won't necessarily experience for every action that they perform, only some of them. There doesn't seem to necessarily be something about the emotional significance or anything of the action which picks out the ones which they become delusional about. As you can see, quite neutral stuff. In Spencer's study, patients can become delusional about, and so on as well. So this is the problem. It's been called the occasionality problem by Proust. A few other people talked about it before her. But this is something that seems to be a problem for these models, and why a lot of people have come to reject, usually the comparator model, although you can say the same thing for Wegner's model. If, as I've argued elsewhere, Wegner's model could explain delusions of alien control as involving a deficit in the sense of agency arising from a failure to represent mental states as prior to the actions that occur, and there's a variety of reasons to think. Some studies to do with intentional binding that suggest that patients suffering this delusion aren't as good at recognising or remembering when their mental states occur, or rather when their actions occur. So, I mean, there is a possibility of Wegner's model explaining a deficit of sense of agency here, but again, why wouldn't they get the delusion for all of their actions? That's the worry. Now, of course, a lot of people have suggested, and I was one of them at one point, that, well, we've got reason to think that the mechanism for eliciting the sense of agency for whatever reason fails occasionally. Like, say, perhaps with the comparator model, the problem is not that predictions aren't being formed, it's just that they're inaccurate, and so sometimes they happen to get the right sorts of matches and sometimes they don't, and then that's why. But the problem is that there isn't a lot of independent evidence for this kind of thinking. In fact, for the accuracy of predictions, what seems to be happening in this is some stuff that's coming out of Matea's synoptics lab, is that the predictions just become less accurate, and when they, so they fall into a broader range of. So I'll go through the example. So it's like if you're doing a point-to-point movement, more deviations from what you actually perform are recognised as being the same action for these subjects. So it seems like they're just sort of less accurate, and so they should be making more matches. So if that's why, then all sorts of problems with the comparator model, but certainly no reason to think that you're just going to be getting these occasional mismatches. The other problem with this kind of line of reasoning is that, without any good independent evidence that these mechanisms do just stop working sometimes, is it's quite an ad hoc solution. It's like, well, we're just going to hold on to the comparator model or Wegener's model or what have you, and say, well, this gives us reason to believe something which we are then going to use to explain a fact which is a challenge to the model. That's pretty ad hoc. But I think there's, if we take a step back and go to again, drawing this distinction between unconscious representations and conscious experiences of agency, we can just avoid this problem in the first place. So here's the basic thought. If we think back to the Mars account, then what's being explained by the subject is an anomalous experience. And that's what becomes the delusion. But if the output of, say, the comparator model is not always conscious, so the anomalous experience that needs to be explained is the lack of a sense of agency. But if the output of the comparator model is not always conscious, sometimes it's just an unconscious representation of agency, its absence isn't always going to be noticed by the subject, and so it isn't always going to trigger this inferential process leading to the delusion. So what we want to know is, why is it sometimes conscious, such that it's, or it should sometimes be conscious, such that its absence would be noticed and lead to the delusion, and why sometimes would it just sort of hang out and be fairly irrelevant for the subject? Yes, the representation is elicited, but it's not going to be used in any way, perhaps. It's not going to become conscious, so those instances, there's no anomaly to be noticed, which needs to be explained by the subject. Now, I think we can see there that although we're starting to get to some interesting questions about sense of agency, why is there sometimes an unconscious representation, why is there sometimes a conscious sense, but just by making this distinction, we needn't worry that the occasionality problem is actually an objection to these existent models. And that, I want to suggest, is just a bit of a theoretical payoff for this more literature, the sense of agency research literature, which could be, which arises from taking this conscious-unconscious distinction seriously. Alright, now, starting to run out of time, and I wanted to spend some time on what it is that we should be doing if we're interested in sense of agency and we want to be explaining why sometimes you get a conscious sense and sometimes just an unconscious representation. Now, this question, I think, is the same as what Dan Dennett calls the hard question in Consciousness Explained. One of his sort of diagnoses of the Cartesian theatre way of explaining consciousness is that what people seem to do is say, here's an experience that needs to be explained, so let's talk about how the content of that experience gets fixed, the representation and content of that experience gets fixed. But then they don't ask the hard question, which is, then what happens? And if you don't answer that question, then you can't distinguish between that content getting fixed and it becoming conscious, and that content getting fixed and it's remaining unconscious. And it seems to me that this is exactly what's been going on in the sense of agency research. Is we've just been saying, here's how you get the representation with that content. I am the agent of this action. But we haven't been going on and asking ourselves the hard question. Now, the good thing for the sense of agency researcher is that there's lots of other areas of consciousness studies, all of which have been thinking quite a lot about this hard question and how unconscious and conscious representations get distinguished or are distinct within a cognitive system. So, one answer which has become reasonably popular recently with the work of Jesse Prince is that it's attention. Conscious representations are those things which are attended to, and unconscious representations remain unconscious because they're never attended to. They never enter into the mechanisms of attention. Now, the problem with applying this sort of account is that attention doesn't seem to be sufficient for consciousness. So, suppose we have a setup with a fixation point, and sorry, this pen's really bad. Two rectangles, one either side of the fixation point. If we prime one of the rectangles, so with a dot there, people will be faster at identifying the colour of a target X if it appears within the same shape as the prime, than if it appears the same distance from the prime but within a different shape. So this is an old effect in object attention research. Now, recently what Norman and colleagues have done, this is work with Bob Kentridge, is they replicated this study, but they made the boxes invisible. So how they did this was they had a grid array of Gabor patches, which just look like shaded circles if you're not familiar with a Gabor patch. And they had them, the shading forms lines within it. And they had it so that the lines of the shading could be vertical or horizontal. And they flickered the display such that they were going from vertical to horizontal back and forwards really fast. Now, what subjects report when they see this is a flickering display. Cool. So what they did then was made some of the patches flicker out of phase with the rest of them, such that while most of them were going vertical to horizontal, the one sort of laid out in a rectangular shape would go horizontal to vertical and just stay out of phase. Now, you do this fast enough, subjects say they can't see a shape there, and they're no better than chance at just guessing if there is the shape there. But what you find in doing that is then if you then perform this study, and you just have a hole in a gap where the prime or the target can appear, is that you get the same attentional effect of facilitation for the target, which appears in the same shape as the prime, even though the shape is not reportable by subjects and apparently visible to them because they can't guess whether or not they're present. So if we take this facilitation effect to be an attentional effect, which is the standard reading in the literature, then it seems that you can attend to things that you can't see, or that you can attend to things that you can't experience. So this is just one example and one way of suggesting that attention, at least on its own, is not going to be enough to explain why sometimes a representation, in this case of a shape, becomes conscious and why sometimes it doesn't. Alright, so another thing which is taken to be sometimes important for consciousness is the ability to report an experience. And this is particularly relevant to the sense of agency literature because the standard measures of sense of agency all involve verbal report of some kind, usually declaring a number on a scale of, say, how much you feel like you're in control or something like that. There are, of course, intentional binding measures of sense of agency as well, which some people will be familiar with, but there's considerable controversy about what they measure. And at any rate, most of the measures of sense of agency have been verbal report. So maybe, we could just be a bit old-fashioned and say sense of agency, an unconscious representation of agency becomes a conscious representation when it enters into the mechanisms for verbal report. But again, there's going to be some fairly standard objections to this, namely, we have pretty good evidence for
good news, everyone!
in non-verbal animals. In particular, things like greater apes, European magpies, elephants, maybe dolphins, all of which can pass mirror self-recognition tests. For those who don't know, the mirror self-recognition test, you take an animal, usually anaesthetise it. There's no real need to be that cruel, but that's what people did. And then you mark a part of their body that they can't see with a red dye, one that isn't itchy and doesn't smell. And then you say, well, they recognise themselves in a mirror if, when they wake up and see a mirror, they start playing with the mark on their forehead, whatever part of the body it is, and going, why is that there? Right? Yeah, to over-mentalise. I'm saying that's my excuse for over-mentalising. So, to do this, or to ever recognise yourself in the mirror, we generally think that how creatures learn to do this is by recognising a match between the action that they, or the movements that they see being performed in the mirror by the reflection and the movements that they themselves are doing. To do that, you need to know what actions you're performing, what actions are your actions and not the actions of someone else in the environment. To do that, you need a sense of agency. Recognising yourself in the mirror obviously takes heaps more than sense of agency, but in general, we're pretty confident that if you pass the mirror self-recognition test, you have a sense of agency. Lots of non-verbal creatures seem to pass mirror self-recognition tests, so we don't think that being available for report is necessary for having a conscious sense of agency. So that's a couple of, rather one really old-fashioned and outdated, and one more recent but probably wrong account of the difference between conscious and unconscious representations. Now, both of these accounts of what makes something conscious are functionalist accounts. So they say that what makes a representation conscious is what it does in the cognitive system after it's formed. So it's formed, and then it plays the role of, driving speech or entering entering the mechanisms of attention, and that's what it is to be conscious of it. Now, there are lots of other functionalist accounts, open global workspace theory, Dennett's multiple drafts view, which would say, all right, cool, but the functional role that is consciousness isn't just one thing. It's not just attention or verbal report. It's a whole bunch of stuff. Those options are still open, but there is another option within the consciousness studies work, which is work sense of agency people are thinking about, and these are vehicle theories of consciousness. And what a vehicle theory says is it's not so much a matter of, answering the hard question is not so much a matter of saying, once the content is formed, then what happens? Then what does it do within the system? But instead posits that there are two distinct forms of representation within the brain, one of which is unconscious and one of which is conscious. Now, there's a few different forms that this approach can take, but starting with the people who have introduced the term vehicle theories is O'Brien and Opie. So we'll just talk about their version. What they suggest is essentially that if we're going to answer the hard question, the answer is going to be something of the form, the representation changes from one form to another. And they suggest that the two important forms of representation are explicit representations, and this is taken from Dennett's old taxonomy, where explicit representations are physically distinct objects, each possessing of a single semantic value. These are often analysed as stable patterns of activity within neural networks because O'Brien and Opie are connectionists. And then that's going to stand in contrast to potentially explicit or tacit representations. Now, there is a difference between potentially explicit and tacit representations, but because these guys are connectionists and this distinction doesn't apply in connectionist networks, we're just going to treat them as the same. And, I've only got about 30 seconds left, so I just want to wind up. So, to say something is potentially explicit or tacit is to say that the system has the capacity to form an explicit representation, which means to token an individual which has a determined semantic value. Representational content. Alright. So, if we were to take this sort of view, then we want to be looking for, in the instance of consciousness, conscious experience of agency, explicit representing vehicles, and when it's unconscious, something in the system which means that the system has the capacity to produce that representation, but it just happens not to on that instant. It's not needed for whatever reason. So, if we were to go to take this view, we would. We are
good news, everyone.
Looking for a bit. So the question that we would ask is, how do potentially explicit representations become explicit? That's the mechanistic point that we want to be looking for. If we were to take a functionalist approach, we'd be wanting to say, how representations further processed and which of those processes are necessary for consciousness. If we take the vehicle approach, then our question is, how do things become explicit from just being potentially explicit? So I want to wind up there, but what I hope I've been able to suggest, and apologies for not making much sense and having to pause all the time, what I hope I've been able to suggest is that sense of agency research, for all its strengths, just doesn't seem to be asking this question, the hard question. What's the difference between an unconscious representation and a conscious one? I think this matters not just because it's an interesting question, but because it has theoretical payoffs within the sense of agency research. And hopefully what we've got in closing is a couple of different ways which we might think about answering that question, depending on positions that we would take from the broader consciousness studies literature. So there we go. That's my best effort.